The old man's words hit harder than the Dakota wind. You have brought shame to this family. You are no daughter of mine. 17-year-old Marina Walsh didn't even flinch. She just stared into the cold, unforgiving eyes of her father, Jeremy A. Walsh, the most powerful man in Cedar Falls. The banker, the man whose reputation was built on iron and stone. He stood in the doorway of the life she had always known, and with those few words he had locked it forever. He pressed $17 into her hand, one for every year of her life, and pointed toward the dusty road that disappeared into the prairie. Be gone before the town wakes, he hissed, and never return. He didn't look at her growing belly, the source of his fury. To him, it didn't exist. She didn't exist. As the heavy oak door boomed shut, sealing her fate, Marina turned her back on the only home she'd ever known. She had nothing but the clothes on her back, $17, and a secret growing inside her. The town would wake up and whisper that she had vanished. They would be wrong. She wasn't vanishing. She was being reborn in ice and stone. 3 miles outside of town, hidden behind a snarled curtain of juniper trees, was a place the townsfolk avoided. They called it the Widow's Bluff, a place of bad spirits and worse memories. Stories said a woman had lost her mind there decades ago, and her ghost still haunted the limestone caves carved into the hillside. But Marina wasn't afraid of ghosts. She was afraid of freezing to death. She pushed through the brush, her hands raw, and found the opening. A dark mouth in the rock face, breathing cold air. It was bigger than she expected, a main chamber with smaller passages branching off like the hallways of a forgotten home. And in the center, a miracle. A small spring bubbled up from the earth, offering clean, fresh water. This would be her sanctuary. In those first weeks, she survived on what her grandmother had taught her. Wild berries, edible roots, the occasional rabbit caught in a crude snare. She made a bed from pine boughs and learned to build smokeless fires deep in the cave, where the smoke could vanish through cracks in the stone. The girl who left Cedar Falls was scared and broken, but the woman in the cave was learning to fight. Every sunrise was a victory. Every meal was a defiance. But as her belly grew, a cold fear began to seep in, a fear worse than any winter storm. The baby was coming, and she was completely, terrifyingly alone. Then one morning, she saw him, a rider on the trail below the bluff. He was a tall man on a practical horse, his face weathered by the sun and wind. He wasn't one of the boys from town. This was a man who knew the land. He stopped, dismounted, and stared directly at the spot where she was hidden. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Had she been discovered? Was he sent by her father? He stood perfectly still for a long minute, his eyes scanning the hillside. Marina held her breath, convinced he was about to call her out, to drag her back to the shame she had escaped. Instead, he did something strange. He walked to a low-hanging branch, tied a small bundle to it, and remounted his horse. Without a single backward glance, he rode away, disappearing over the next rise. She waited until the sound of hoofbeats had completely faded before she dared to move. Her hands trembled as she untied the cloth bundle. Inside was jerky, hardtack, and dried apples. A feast. But tucked within the food was a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was neat, careful. It wasn't a threat. It was a lifeline. These hills can be dangerous, the note read. There is a ranch 5 miles south. Follow the creek if you need help. But there was something else in the bundle, something that made the air freeze in her lungs. Tucked into a fold of the cloth was a small silver locket. It was tarnished with age, but she recognized the delicate engraving instantly. It was her mother's, the locket she had been buried with 5 years ago. Who was this man? And how did he have her dead mother's locket? The locket wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a question, a terrifying, impossible question that echoed in the silence of the cave. Her father had been the one who closed the coffin. He had been the one to place the locket around her mother's neck for her final journey. So how did this stranger have it? The food he'd left was a mystery. The locket was a threat. Was this a warning? A message from her father, delivered by a hired hand, telling her she was being watched? Or was it something else entirely? For days, Marina didn't dare leave the cave during daylight. She watched the trail, her heart leaping at every shadow, every gust of wind that sounded like a horse. The man didn't return. The prairie remained empty. But the locket sat on a rock shelf, a cold silver eye watching her. It changed everything. She was no longer just a girl surviving against the odds. She was part of a story she didn't understand, a story that had followed her from Cedar Falls and into the wilderness. The fear of being alone was replaced by the fear of not being alone enough. The first contraction hit her at dawn, sharp and undeniable. It was too soon. The baby wasn't due for weeks. Panic seized her, cold and sharp. She thought of the note, 5 miles south. Follow the creek. It seemed like 100 miles now, but the image of the locket burned in her mind. Trusting a stranger was a risk. Dying alone in the cave was a certainty. She packed a small bundle, the last of her food, and the $17 her father had given her. And the locket. She had to know. The journey was a nightmare. The path down the bluff was treacherous, slick with melting snow. Each contraction forced her to her knees, the pain a white-hot wave that stole her breath. She clung to trees, crawled over rocks, her world shrinking to the next step, the next breath. The creek was her only guide, a silver ribbon cutting through the bleak landscape. She followed it blindly, fueled by a primal fear for the life inside her. Hours bled together. The sun rose high in the sky, then began its slow descent. She lost track of time, lost track of everything but the rhythm of pain and the desperate need to keep moving. Finally, in a grove of cottonwoods, her legs gave out. She collapsed, the world spinning into darkness. This was it. This was where she and her child would die, unnamed and unknown. But as her vision faded, she heard a sound. Hoof beats, getting closer. A figure dismounted, his boots crunching on the fallen leaves. It was him, the rider. He knelt beside her, his face a mask of concern. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I'm Thomas Brennan. You're on my land now. You're safe." She tried to speak, to ask him about the locket, but another contraction ripped through her, and all she could manage was a single, gasped word. "Marina." He didn't seem surprised to hear her name. Thomas Brennan moved with a strange efficiency, as if he'd been expecting her. He had a blanket from his horse around her in seconds, his hands gentle but firm. "The baby's coming," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "We don't have time to get you to the house." He let out a sharp, piercing whistle, and his horse, without any further command, turned and galloped back in the direction from which they'd come. A signal. Marina watched him through a haze of pain. He worked with a calm that was unnerving. He had water from his canteen, clean claws from his saddlebag. He seemed to know exactly what to do, what to say. It was as if he'd rehearsed this moment. "I saw you on the bluff a few days ago," he said, his voice low as he helped her through another wave of pain. "I was worried you wouldn't make it." How had he known she was pregnant? How had he known she was in trouble? And the locket, she had to ask. Between breaths, she fumbled in her bundle and held it out. "This!" she gasped. "Where did you get this?" He looked at the silver oval in her palm, and for the first time, his calm expression faltered. A shadow passed over his eyes, something deep and old. "Your mother," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She gave it to me, a long time ago." Before Marina could process the impossible words, the world exploded in pain. The baby was here. It was a boy. As his first cry cut through the prairie air, Thomas wrapped him in a cloth and placed him in Marina's arms. He was perfect. He was alive. As she looked down at her son, and then up at the stranger who seemed to know all her secrets, she realized her ordeal wasn't over. It was just beginning. Just as the foreman arrived with a wagon, summoned by the horse, Thomas looked down at the newborn baby, and his face went pale. He pointed a trembling finger at the tiny tuft of hair on the baby's head. It was shockingly, brilliantly red, the exact same shade as Thomas Brennan's own hair. The ride to the ranch house was a blur. Marina clutched her son, Samuel, to her chest, her mind reeling. Her mother had known this man. This man had her mother's locket. And now her son had this man's hair. The boy who had fled town, the boy everyone assumed was the father, had brown hair. So did she. So did her father. There was no red hair in the Walsh family. It was impossible. but the proof was nestled in her arms, sleeping peacefully. The Brennan Ranch house was large and sturdy, built for a family that no longer existed. A woman with kind eyes and gentle hands met them at the door. Her name was Maria Santos, the housekeeper. She took one look at Marina, then at the baby, and her eyes widened. She shot a look at Thomas, a silent question passing between them. Then she took charge, getting Marina settled into a warm bed, bringing hot broth and clean clothes. She didn't ask a single question about where Marina had come from. It was as if she already knew. Thomas stood in the doorway watching them. His face was a storm of emotions Marina couldn't decipher. He looked at Samuel, then at her, and the pieces of a puzzle she didn't even know existed began to slide into place. "Your mother and I," Thomas began, his voice heavy, "we knew each other a long time ago, before she married your father." The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating, but that couldn't be right. The timing was all wrong. "She was happy," Marina whispered, defending a memory. "She loved my father." Thomas just shook his head slowly. "Jeremiah Walsh is a man who takes what he wants, Marina. Your mother made a choice to protect you." What did that mean? Protect her from what? From whom? The pieces weren't fitting. They were shattering. Her whole life, her entire understanding of her family, was a lie. Her father wasn't just cruel. He was a thief who had stolen her mother's happiness. And Thomas? Was he her savior? Or just another man with a claim on her life? That night, as Marina rocked Samuel to sleep, she studied his face. He had her nose, her mouth, but his eyes, when they opened, were a startling shade of hazel. And that hair, that fiery red hair. The question was no longer who Samuel's father was. The question was why her own father had gone to such lengths to cast her out, to erase her from his life. It wasn't just about shame. It was about a secret her father would kill to protect. And now that secret was sleeping in her arms. Life at the Brennan Ranch settled into a strange rhythm. On the surface, it was peaceful. Marina healed, Samuel grew, and the vast empty house began to feel like a home. The ranch hands were respectful. Maria was a wellspring of quiet wisdom. And Thomas was an enigma. He was kind, patient, teaching her about the ranch, about the land. He spent hours with Samuel, holding him with a tenderness that made Marina's heart ache. They talked for hours about books, about the future, about everything except the one thing that mattered. They never spoke of her mother again. They never spoke of the locket. And they never spoke of Samuel's impossible red hair. It was a silent agreement, a wall of unspoken truce between them. Marina worked hard, eager to earn her keep. She helped Maria in the kitchen, learned to mend clothes for the ranch hands, and brought an order to the household that had been missing for years. She was proving she was more than her father's shame. She was a survivor. But every time she caught Thomas looking at Samuel, she saw it in his eyes. The hunger for an answer he was afraid to ask for. She knew she couldn't hide on the ranch forever. Sooner or later, the world would find her. And it found her in the form of Benjamin Clark, the town blacksmith, a man whose love of gossip was matched only by his skill with a hammer. He was at the ranch to shoe horses when he saw her. He didn't say a word, just stared, his eyes wide with recognition. By the time he got back to Cedar Falls, the story was already spreading like a prairie fire. Marina Walsh was alive, and she was living with Thomas Brennan, and she had a baby. The news hit Cedar Falls like a lightning strike. The whispers in the general store, the shocked gasps after Sunday service, it all found its way back to the one place it was destined to cause the most damage, the oak-paneled office of the town bank. Jeremiah Walsh received the news with a face like carved granite. His daughter was alive. The relief was a flicker, quickly extinguished by a cold, calculating rage. She hadn't just survived. She had defied him. She had found shelter with the one man in the territory he could not afford to make an enemy of. Thomas Brennan wasn't just some rancher. His family had deep roots, and his name carried weight. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the shame. His daughter, living in sin, her bastard child, a living monument to his family's disgrace. This was a loose end he had to tie up, permanently. He arrived at the ranch on a blistering July morning. He wasn't alone. Sheriff Morrison was with him, his face etched with discomfort. Two other men from the town, grim-faced and silent, rode behind them. It wasn't a rescue party, it was an invasion. Thomas met them in the main corral. He had seen them coming from a mile away. "Walsh," he said, his voice level, betraying no emotion. "Mr. Brennan," Jeremiah spat, dismounting, "I've come for my daughter." Marina heard the voices and stepped out of the house, Samuel resting on her hip. The sight of her father stole the air from her lungs. He looked older, his hair grayer, but the cold fire in his eyes was the same. "Hello, father," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. The girl he had thrown out into the cold was gone. "You will gather your things," Jeremiah commanded, ignoring the baby in her arms. "This arrangement is over." Thomas stepped forward, placing himself between them, a silent protector. "Marina is a guest here. She is free to choose." "She is my daughter, a minor," Jeremiah's voice cracked. "The law is on my side." Sheriff Morrison shifted his weight. "Marina, you're 17. Legally, he has authority." Marina looked from her father's hateful glare to Thomas's steady gaze. Then she looked down at Samuel. This wasn't about her anymore. "What kind of life are you offering, father?" she asked, her voice ringing with a strength that surprised them all. "Will you welcome my son? Will you call him your grandson?" Jeremiah's face twisted in disgust. "That child is the evidence of your sin. He will never set foot in my house." "Then I will never set foot in your house," she replied, her voice like steel. The standoff was absolute, a father's pride against a mother's love. But then Thomas did something no one could have predicted. He turned to Jeremiah, his expression completely serious. "Mr. Walsh," he said, his voice carrying across the silent yard, "I would like to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage." The silence that followed was so profound, you could hear the buzz of a fly a dozen yards away. Jeremiah Walsh's face went from red to purple. Sheriff Morrison's jaw hung open. And Marina just stared at Thomas, her heart hammering against her ribs. Was this real? Was this a trick? "You cannot be serious," Jeremiah finally choked out. "I am completely serious," Thomas said, his eyes never leaving Jeremiah's. "I have come to care for Marina and for Samuel. I will provide for them. I will protect them, and I will give Samuel my name." He then turned to Marina, and his gaze softened. "You don't have to answer now," he said gently, "but the offer is real, and it comes from my heart." Tears welled in Marina's eyes, but they weren't tears of fear. For the first time, someone was offering her a future built on hope, not shame. It was a shield, a way out. But was it a cage of a different kind? She looked at Samuel, cooing in her arms, blissfully unaware that his entire future was being decided in this dusty corral. She took a deep breath. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I accept." Jeremiah looked as if he'd been struck. He had come to reclaim his property, to erase his mistake. Instead, he had just witnessed her being offered a life of legitimacy and respect, a life with a man more honorable than he could ever hope to be. He had lost, utterly. He mounted his horse without another word, his face a mask of thunderous fury, and rode away, his posse trailing behind him like defeated dogs. As the dust settled, Marina turned to Thomas, the weight of her decision crashing down on her. "Did you mean it?" she whispered. "Every word," he said. But his eyes held a secret, a depth of purpose she still couldn't fathom. "But there's something you need to know about your father, and about your mother. The story you were told about her death. It was a lie." The world tilted on its axis. "What lie?" Marina asked, her voice barely a whisper. Samuel fussed in her arms, sensing the sudden tension. Thomas led her to the porch, away from the curious eyes of the ranch hands. "Your mother didn't die of a fever, Marina," he said, his voice low and pained. "She died giving birth to your father's child, a stillborn son." Marina sank into a chair, her legs unable to hold her. It didn't make sense. She was 5 years old when her mother died. She remembered the funeral, the hushed whispers about a sudden illness. "No," she said, shaking her head. "That's not possible." "Your father's pride couldn't handle the truth," Thomas continued, his voice laced with an old bitterness. "He couldn't stand the thought of the town knowing his wife died in childbirth, a common and, in his eyes, vulgar way to die. He wanted a legacy, a son to take over his bank. When the baby died and took your mother with him, Jeremy erased the entire story. He paid the doctor to sign a false death certificate. He created the fiction of a sudden fever to preserve his precious reputation. He paused, letting the monstrous truth sink in. He buried his wife and son under a lie. He gave me this locket that day, telling me to disappear from Cedar Falls forever. He said your mother never wanted to see me again. I believed him. A picture began to form in Marina's mind, a dark and twisted mosaic. Her father's coldness after her mother's death, his obsession with appearances, his violent reaction to her own pregnancy. It wasn't just about her shame, it was about his. Her pregnancy was a grotesque echo of the past he had tried to bury. He hadn't just thrown her out. He was trying to erase a ghost. So you and my mother... Marina couldn't finish the sentence. We were in love, Thomas said simply. But she chose your father. She thought he could give you a better life, a stable life. She made me promise I would always watch over you, no matter what. A promise I've kept from a distance, until now. He looked down at Samuel, his red hair like a beacon in the afternoon sun. When I saw you on the bluff, I knew I had to help. When I saw Samuel, I knew Jeremy's lies ran deeper than I ever imagined. The pieces clicked into place. The locket wasn't a threat. It was a promise fulfilled. Thomas's kindness wasn't random. It was a debt of love owed to her mother. And his proposal of marriage wasn't just a convenient solution. It was an act of war against Jeremy Walsh. He won't let this go, Marina said, a new fear taking root. He won't let us be happy. I know, Thomas said, his hand closing over hers. But he's not the only one with secrets. Your father built his bank on borrowed money, Marina. Money borrowed from my family years ago. A debt he has never repaid. He thinks he holds all the power in Cedar Falls. He's about to find out he's wrong. The wedding was a quiet affair, held in the parlor of the ranch house with only Maria, the foreman, and a traveling preacher as witnesses. But it felt more real, more binding than any grand ceremony in the Cedar Falls church. It wasn't just a union of two people. It was the forging of an alliance. Thomas was true to his word. He gave Samuel his name, legally adopting him as his son and heir. The adoption papers were filed in the territorial capital, far from the reach of Jeremy Walsh's influence. In the eyes of the law, Samuel Brennan was no longer the evidence of a young girl's shame. He was the future of one of the territory's most respected ranches. Life settled into a new normal, but beneath the surface, the tension hummed. They were a family, but they were also soldiers waiting for the next battle. Marina found herself falling in love with Thomas, not for the protection he offered, but for the man he was. His quiet strength, his surprising intellect, his gentle devotion to Samuel. He, in turn, treated her not as a girl he had rescued, but as an equal partner. He valued her opinion on ranch matters, marveled at her resilience, and seemed to find a long-lost piece of himself in the family she had brought back into his silent house. But the shadow of Jeremy Walsh was ever present. News from town trickled back to the ranch. Her father was telling everyone that Thomas had been tricked, that a scheming girl had trapped him using her illegitimate child. He was painting himself as the victim, a father whose kindness had been betrayed. He was trying to poison the well, to turn the territory against them. He's trying to isolate us, Thomas said one evening, looking over his account books. If he can ruin my reputation, he thinks he can ruin my business. He's calling in favors, pressuring my suppliers. And the debt? Marina asked. The money he owes your family? A grim smile touched Thomas's lips. He thinks the original loan documents were lost in a fire years ago. He doesn't know my father kept copies in a safe deposit box in Denver. I have them. It was their trump card, their weapon of last resort, but using it would mean all-out war, a war that would tear Cedar Falls apart. Marina knew her father. He would not go down quietly. He would rather burn everything to the ground than admit defeat. The first real test came not from her father, but from the land itself. The winter of 1888 arrived with a vengeance, a brutal, relentless season of blizzards that cut the ranch off from the rest of the world for weeks at a time. It was a trial by ice and snow, a stark contrast to the lonely winter she had spent in the cave. This time, she wasn't alone. She was part of a team, a family fighting to protect their home and their livestock. The brutal weather, however, brought an unexpected complication. A wagon train of settlers, caught unprepared, sought refuge at the ranch. Among them was a young widow, Catherine Meller, with 3 small children. Marina saw in Catherine's eyes the same desperate fear she had once felt. Without hesitation, she and Thomas took them in. The house, once so quiet, was suddenly filled with the noise and chaos of children. And in helping Catherine, Marina discovered something new in herself, a calling. The ranch house transformed. What was once a quiet refuge became a bustling sanctuary. Marina, who had fought to save her own child, now found herself a mother to a house full of them. She organized lessons for the Muller children, herding them through reading and arithmetic with the same determination she applied to everything else. Catherine, in turn, became the sister Marina never had. They spent long evenings by the fire, mending clothes, sharing stories, and forging a friendship in the crucible of that harsh winter. As the storms raged outside, Marina felt a sense of purpose that went beyond her own survival. She had been given a second chance, and she was determined to use it to help others. This realization crystallized into a clear, sharp focus one night in February. A new family, the Petersons, arrived at the ranch in the dead of a blizzard, their wagon broken, the father injured, and the mother, Astrid, in the early stages of labor. Marina looked at Astrid's terrified face and saw herself, the desperate girl in the cottonwood grove. But this time was different. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't alone. With Maria's experienced guidance and Thomas's steady support, Marina helped deliver that baby. In that room, as little Eric Peterson took his first breath, Marina Brennan was reborn. The survivor became a healer. She devoured every medical book in Thomas's library, her mind hungry for knowledge. She realized her own ordeal had given her a unique understanding, a compassion that no doctor's school could teach. "I want to become a midwife," she told Thomas, the words feeling more right than anything she had ever said. "I want to make sure no woman in this territory ever has to face what I did." His face lit up with a pride that warmed her to the core. "You already are one," he said, "and you'll be the best this land has ever seen." Spring finally broke the winter's grip. The settlers moved on, but Catherine Muller decided to stay, accepting Thomas's offer of a homestead on a section of his land. The ranch was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was filled with the echoes of community, the promise of a future that was about to get much more complicated. Marina was pregnant again. This time there was no shame, only joy. Thomas was ecstatic. "Samuel needs a brother or a sister," he declared, his eyes shining. This child would be theirs from the very beginning, a symbol of their new life, conceived in love, not desperation. But their joy was short-lived. A writer arrived from Cedar Falls with a letter. It wasn't from her father. It was from the bank's board of directors. They were calling a special meeting. Jeremy Walsh's leadership was being questioned. His increasingly erratic behavior and his public feud with Thomas Brennan were making the investors nervous. And in the letter was a formal request. They wanted a statement from Marina. They wanted her to tell them on the record her side of the story. Her father had tried to erase her. Now a group of powerful men were asking her to help them erase him. The request was a trap, and Marina knew it. If she testified against her father, she would be seen as a vengeful daughter, confirming his narrative that she was unstable and manipulative. If she refused, the board might back her father, consolidating his power and leaving him free to continue his war against her and Thomas. It was a checkmate move, and it had her father's cunning cruelty written all over it. "He wants to force my hand," she told Thomas, pacing the parlor. "He wants me to destroy myself in front of the very people whose opinion he cares about most." "Then we don't play his game," Thomas said. "We change the board." He opened his safe and took out the copies of the old loan documents. "This isn't just a personal debt, Marina. He used the bank's own funds as collateral for a loan he used to build his personal fortune. He gambled with his investors' money. What you have to tell them isn't a story about a cruel father. It's a story about a corrupt banker who is a threat to every person who has a dollar in his bank." The day of the board meeting, Marina and Thomas rode into Cedar Falls together. It was the first time she had been back since the night she was cast out. People stopped and stared. Whispers followed them down the main street. She held her head high, Samuel sitting proudly in front of Thomas on the saddle. She was not the shame girl who had fled in the dark. She was Marina Brennan, wife of Thomas Brennan, and she was here to reclaim her story. The meeting was held in the bank's boardroom, the same oak-paneled room where her father had pronounced her sentence. Jeremiah sat at the head of the table, flanked by the town's wealthiest men. He looked shocked to see them, his composure cracking for just a second. "This is a private meeting," he snapped. "She is here at our invitation," the board chairman said coolly. Marina took her seat, placed her hands on the polished table, and began to speak. She didn't talk about the cold night, or the cave, or her fear. She spoke calmly and clearly about her father's obsession with his legacy, his willingness to sacrifice his own family for his reputation. And then Thomas laid the loan documents on the table. The silence was deafening as the board members examined the proof of Jeremiah's fraud. The signatures, the dates, the clauses. It was all there. Undeniable. Jeremiah Walsh, the pillar of the community, was a thief. He sat there, his face ashen, as his entire world crumbled around him. He had been so focused on the battle, he never saw the war was already lost. He was unanimously voted out, stripped of his position, his reputation shattered in a single afternoon. As they left the bank, stepping out into the sunlight, Marina felt no triumph, only a hollow emptiness. She had won, but she had also destroyed her father. Just then, a man came running from the telegraph office. "Mr. Brennan, there's been an accident," he yelled. "A fire at your ranch." Panic clawed at Marina's throat. A fire, with Catherine and her children there alone. They rode like madmen, the 10 miles back to the ranch feeling like 1,000. From the last ridge they saw it, a pillar of black smoke twisting into the sky. It wasn't the main house, it was the north pasture and the barn. They arrived to a scene of controlled chaos. The ranch hands, led by Catherine, were battling the flames, which were consuming the barn and threatening to spread to the surrounding fields. But it wasn't an accident. In the dirt near the smoldering remains of the barn wall was a discarded oil can and a single set of footprints leading away toward the road to Cedar Falls. This was her father's final, desperate act of revenge. If he couldn't have his legacy, he would burn theirs to the ground. The barn was a total loss, and with it, most of their winter hay. It was a devastating blow, one that could cripple the ranch for years. But as they stood surveying the damage, something shifted in Marina. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "He will not beat us," she said, her voice low but fierce. "We will rebuild." The community her father had tried to turn against them was the first to arrive with help. Neighbors came with wagons of hay. The blacksmith, Benjamin Clark, who had once spread gossip about her, offered to help reforge the iron fittings for a new barn, free of charge. The settlers they had sheltered during the winter sent what little money they could spare. The cruelty of one man was being answered by the kindness of many. They were not isolated. They were the heart of a community they had built not with money and power, but with compassion and generosity. In the midst of the rebuilding, Marina's father appeared at the ranch. He was alone, his fine suit smudged with dirt, his face a ruin of despair. He looked like a ghost. He didn't come to gloat or to threaten. He came to surrender. "I am ruined," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "The bank has called in all my personal loans. I have nothing left." He looked at Marina, and for the first time, she didn't see a monster. She saw a broken old man. "I have come to ask for your forgiveness." Forgiveness seemed impossible. He had tried to destroy her, her child, her home, but looking at him, she felt not hatred, but a strange, weary pity. "Forgiveness is not mine to give," she said quietly. "You have to earn it." That autumn, as the new barn rose from the ashes of the old one, their daughter Rebecca was born. And a few months later, Jeremiah Walsh, the former banker, began his penance. He took a job as a common laborer, working alongside the ranch hands he had once looked down upon, helping to rebuild the very barn he had tried to destroy. The road to redemption would be long, but it had begun. Years passed. The ranch flourished, and so did the family. Samuel grew into a strong, kind boy, with Thomas's steady nature and a quiet intelligence that was all his own. Rebecca was a firecracker, with her mother's fierce determination and a sharp mind that missed nothing. The Brennan Ranch became more than just a home. It was a symbol of hope in the territory, a place where second chances were real. Marina's midwifery practice grew beyond anything she had imagined. Women traveled for days to be in her care. Her reputation was built on her skill, but also on her compassion. She never turned anyone away, regardless of their ability to pay. She remembered the cold fear of being alone and pregnant, and she vowed no other woman would suffer that fate if she could help it. She began training other women, sharing her knowledge, creating a network of midwives that stretched across the territory. Her little sanctuary in the hills was becoming an institution. One day, a letter arrived bearing a seal she didn't recognize. It was from a Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, one of the first female physicians in the country, writing from Boston. She had heard of Marina's work, of her astonishingly low mortality rates for both mothers and infants, rates that were unheard of even in the finest city hospitals. She wanted to come and observe Marina's methods. The visit from Dr. Hartwell changed everything. The physician was stunned by what she saw. It wasn't just medicine. It was a holistic approach to care that considered the emotional and psychological well-being of the mother. "What you are doing here is revolutionary," Dr. Hartwell told her. "This isn't just frontier medicine. This could change childbirth for the entire country." The recognition brought new opportunities, an invitation to speak at a medical conference in Chicago, an offer to help establish a maternity ward in a Denver hospital. And then the most startling proposal of all, an invitation to come to Washington, D.C. She was being asked to serve on a new national commission to help write federal legislation that would set standards for maternal health care across the United States. It was an impossible choice. To accept would mean leaving her home, her family, her patients, but to refuse would be to turn her back on a chance to help millions of women. As she wrestled with the decision, her father, now a quiet, stooped old man who had found a fragile peace in his simple life on the ranch, gave her the answer. "When I cast you out," he said, his voice filled with a lifetime of regret, "I was thinking only of myself, of my small world. You have built something so much bigger. Don't make the mistake I did. Don't let your world become too small." She went to Washington. Washington was a world of marble and politics, a far cry from the open prairies of Dakota. It was a world of men in dark suits who debated policies that would affect the lives of women they would never meet. At first, they were dismissive of the midwife from the frontier, but Marina didn't speak to them in the language of politics. She spoke in the language of life and death. She told them the story of Astrid Peterson, giving birth in a blizzard. She told them of Anna Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who nearly died from malnutrition before finding her way to the ranch. She gave a face to their statistics, a voice to the silent suffering of countless women, and they listened. The legislation she helped craft, which became known as the Brennan Act, was a landmark achievement. It funded training for midwives, established safety standards for maternity care, and provided support for rural and underserved communities. She had taken the lessons learned in a cold limestone cave and etched them into the law of the land. She returned home a national hero, but her greatest work was yet to come. With the support of Dr. Hartwell and funding from the new federal programs, she officially founded the Dakota Territory Women's Medical Institute, based right there on the ranch. It wasn't just a school for midwives, it was a center for innovation, a place where women were empowered to become leaders in their communities. Her family grew alongside her work. A third child, David, was born, a quiet, thoughtful boy with an astonishing gift for numbers. Samuel, her firstborn, the child of scandal and survival, decided to become a veterinarian, choosing to dedicate his life to healing the animals that were the lifeblood of their community. Rebecca, her fiery daughter, announced her intention to become a doctor, a surgeon, determined to break down even more barriers than her mother had. The years flowed by, a river of progress and peace. The ranch, the institute, the family. They were all woven together, a tapestry of resilience and love. Then in 1905, another letter arrived. This one was from Stockholm, Sweden. Marina Brennan, the girl once cast out for bringing shame upon her family, had been awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine. The Nobel Prize was not an ending. It was a beginning. It gave Marina a global platform and she used it to champion the cause of women's health around the world. The institute became a beacon, drawing students and doctors from every continent. They came to the Dakota Prairie to learn from the woman who had transformed childbirth from a life-threatening ordeal into a safe and supported experience. Her children soared. Rebecca became a renowned surgeon at Johns Hopkins. David became a brilliant physicist whose work would change the world in ways no one could yet imagine. Samuel's veterinary practice revolutionized animal husbandry across the West. Her father, Jeremiah, lived long enough to see it all. He passed away peacefully at the ranch, having found in his grandchildren's achievements a redemption he never thought possible. Thomas remained her rock, the quiet center of her whirlwind life. Their love, born in crisis and forged in struggle, had deepened into a partnership that was the envy of all who knew them. Then, in 1914, the world went to war. The call came from the Red Cross. They needed experienced medical personnel to serve in the field hospitals of France, where a new kind of industrial warfare was creating casualties on an unimaginable scale. They needed her expertise in trauma and emergency care. At 46, she could have refused. She had earned a lifetime of rest, but that was not who she was. She led a team of her best graduates from the Institute, trading the peaceful plains of Dakota for the blood-soaked fields of Verdun. There, in the mud and the chaos, she saved countless lives, adapting her frontier techniques to the horrors of the battlefield. She was injured during an artillery barrage, shrapnel tearing into her arm, an injury that would finally force her to come home. She returned not just a hero, but a legend. The years that followed were golden. She watched her children have children of their own, filling the old ranch house with a new generation of laughter. She transferred leadership of the Institute to Rebecca, confident that her legacy was in the best possible hands. On her 60th birthday, the Institute hosted an international conference. Hundreds of doctors and midwives, the children and grandchildren of her life's work, came from all over the world to honor her. The final event of the conference was a walk. Marina led them up the winding path to the Widow's Bluff, to the mouth of the cave that had been her first refuge. It was no longer a place of fear and desperation. It was a monument to the strength of the human spirit. She stood there, surrounded by her family, her colleagues, and the generations of healers she had inspired. She looked out over the land that had once been her enemy and had become her home. The journey had been long and impossibly hard, but it had led her here, to a life richer and more meaningful than the frightened girl in the cave could ever have dreamed. She had survived, she had healed, and she had shown the world that from the deepest darkness, the brightest light can be born. If you enjoyed this story of survival and strength, you're going to love the two incredible tales waiting for you on the screen right now. Go ahead and click on one. And before you go, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another story from our channel.